Hello and welcome to RUSI. My name is Neil Melvin and I'm the Director of International Security Studies. It has been an extraordinary presidential election in the United States, following an extraordinary 4 years of the Trump administration. US foreign policy has undergone significant change during that time, and arguably in some areas it's been transformed from its previous approaches. With the election of Joe Biden, there are now major questions about the direction that the US will follow, and how many of the changes that have taken place over the last few years are a reflection of the presidential office holder or of wider changes in US security policy interests and positions around the world. There are already strong indicators of how some of the broad directions and themes of Biden's future foreign policy will begin to look. Writing in Foreign Affairs earlier this year, Biden noted that US credibility and influence around the world had been diminished during the time of President Trump, notably as a result of abandoning US allies and partners. He accused the Trump administration of entering into ill-advised trade wars. But at the same time, he noted that in the last few years, the global challenges facing the US, from climate change and mass migration to technological disruption and infectious diseases, have all grown more complex and more urgent, at the same time as we've seen a rise of authoritarianism, nationalism, and illiberalism in key countries and key regions of the world, which is really undermining the collective ability to meet some of these larger challenges. So in the first few months, we've already had indications that the United States will launch a summit for democracy, a commitment to a normative agenda. The foreign policy of the Biden administration will increasingly focus on developing a foreign policy that fits the economic interests of America's middle classes, and of course that China will be a prominent part of all of this. And above all, that America must reclaim its leading role, including through a recommitment to multilateralism. But what will this agenda mean for specific regions around the world? In today's event, we're going to examine how these issues will affect specific key security regions around the globe, touching on the advice and expertise of the ISS regional research team. Later, there'll be opportunities for our audience to ask questions of our expert panel. Reflecting the importance that the US is increasingly attaching to China, I'd like to begin by asking Vera Nouwens, who leads our Indo-Pacific program. Really, the question, I think, which is probably number one, namely, how will the Biden administration approach China? During the Trump administration, we've seen China as really perhaps the central foreign and security policy issue of the United States. Vera, how do you see this from the Biden administration? Will they take a significantly different approach to China?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. I mean, this is indeed a question on many people's minds. I think overall, as you said, US-China relations has reached its lowest point since 1979. And the Trump administration has taken a particularly aggressive and very vociferous approach towards its relationship with China, whether on a domestic front on how China engages within the United States itself through complaints around espionage, industrial espionage as well, but also Chinese dominance in the tech domain and its export of an authoritarian model and political system, and then of course also human rights abuses. Now, the Biden administration and Biden so far has commented on China itself and some of the concerns that the Biden campaign had with China. Many of these echoed some of the themes I've already just mentioned. So, deepening authoritarianism within China, the human rights situation in Xinjiang, which Biden himself called unconscionable. What's going on in Hong Kong, of course. So these themes around human rights, around values will likely be echoed in a Biden administration. However, I think where we might see differences is in how the Biden administration approaches some areas of cooperation with China. So working together on issue by issue portfolios really, like climate change, will likely be an area where the Biden administration seeks cooperation with China. And of course, there is a concern amongst some countries, notably in Asia, that a Biden administration will simply be Obama 2.0, that we will see a renewed era of engagement with Beijing by Washington. But I think that in itself is still too early to tell, and potentially also a little simplistic. It is, at the end of the day, a fundamentally different atmosphere in the United States, with a bipartisan consensus that China is the strategic rival for the United States, and that this will remain the case moving forwards. That the United States must be able to compete with China and to act strongly against some of the issues of serious concern when it comes to Chinese policy, whether internally or externally. But one thing that the Biden administration will be able to do, I think, is to bring allies and partners with it. That is an issue that the Trump administration ultimately had difficulty with. It wasn't a way in which you could find cooperation amongst your alliances and amongst your partnerships in the region. The expectation is the Biden administration will be able to do so. And at the end of the day, that is problematic for Beijing.
Yeah, on that point about sort of allies and partners, a key pillar of the Trump administration, with its focus on China, has been to try and balance China through this support for the concept of the Indo-Pacific region, and there has been a big investment in that. Do you see a significant shift in the Biden approach to this region? And of course, many people have pointed to the fact that they haven't even mentioned the word Indo-Pacific in many of their strategy documents.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Indo-Pacific has not been mentioned yet. Asia-Pacific has. And so again, there's this question of whether the Biden administration will be Obama 2.0, be a pivot to the Asia-Pacific and not necessarily the Indo-Pacific. I think that would be, I don't think that we will see a complete abandoning of the Indo-Pacific. I think the United States, in terms of the restructuring of certain parts of government, most notably turning PACOM into Indo-PACOM, for example, none of that is going to be reversed. And it remains the case that the Indo-Pacific strategy fundamentally embodies a US approach to a necessity to see the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean regions as intrinsically linked, and that any policy towards it must take both into consideration. However, what I do think we will see is that the United States under a Biden administration will certainly be engaging with regional forums again. This was a major criticism of the Trump administration, that sub-regional forums and multilateral architecture like ASEAN, for example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, was not engaged with sufficiently. In fact, being seen as half the battle, and Trump and the Trump administration was not often seen. So this, I think, will be a crucial element, again, of working with countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, on moving the policy discussion and moving US involvement in this region forward. However, I do think that's important to say that, of course, this emphasis on values will be interesting to see. I don't think we will see the US retreating in any way necessarily, but I think when it comes to a Biden administration, an emphasis on values will have to be negotiated and will have to be walked very carefully. Of course, the issue of values is sensitive in different parts of Southeast Asia. Whilst we talk about like-minded states and we talk about shared values, not all of these values are necessarily shared all the time. And so how you walk that line has to be very carefully balanced with other priorities of these countries themselves. But I think that in any case, this administration, as we move forward, if it is a Biden administration, we will see deeper engagement and closer engagement with countries in the region to understand what their priorities are and what the United States can do in collaboration to help mitigate some of those challenges.
I mean, alongside China, the United States has highlighted the Russian Federation as its the second sort of major state competitor, state actor that it has to deal with. Ahead of the election, Joe Biden actually identified Russia as the main threat to the United States, which of course contrasted to President Trump's generally more status quo focused approach. I'd like to turn to Emily Ferris, who leads our Russia and the World program. Emily, do you think there'll be substantive changes in US policy towards Russia under the Biden administration? And how do you see Russia responding to any such shifts by the US?
Oh, well, thanks very much, Neil. I mean, I think it is a little bit easier for Russia under a potential Biden presidency because rather like Clinton, Hillary Clinton, I mean, Biden is a bit of a known for them. The Russians have met him before. This is something that Biden actually mentioned himself. When he speaks about Russia, he says, the Russians know me. His approach to Russia is probably a little bit more predictable than Trump's. I think the Russians found it exceptionally challenging under Trump, even though he professed, at least at the beginning, that he wanted sort of a better relationship, and he had this interest in courting Mr. Putin, but that didn't really go anywhere because obviously he was restricted by very kind of bipartisan support from across the Republican and Democratic Party against Russia. So there wasn't much that he could in terms of deepening that relationship. The American policy throughout Trump's presidency has really been to continue the status quo, which has been to advocate for sanctions on Russia, and that hasn't really changed. And I think the Russian perspective at the moment, a potential Biden presidency would see a continuation of those sanctions. One of the things that I think Vila has touched on at the beginning was America's very vociferous criticism of China. That's certainly something I think the Russians silently approved of in Trump's administration, certainly. There's lots of different reasons for that, which I'm very happy to go into in the questions. But, I think Russia found America's bid to sort of put China in their place a little reassuring, given their competition in lots of different areas, economically, militarily, and then, just competition around the BRI and in Central Asia. So I think a Biden presidency would be a more organized presidency. There could be some scope for cooperation, and Biden's mentioned that a few times. There are a few key issues that I think he seems to have an interest in. There are things like strategic arms control, because obviously the New START treaty expires in February, and Biden's indicated his interests in trying to renew that, or at least some form of discussion around nuclear arms controls. But then again, Biden, if we recall in his previous roles in the administration, he already oversaw a reset with Russia. He was in the administration when there was this sort of disastrous reset between the Americans and the Russians that just didn't work. So I think that the discussion among the Russian political community at the moment is, will Biden be interested in trying this reset again? And the answer they think is probably not. I mean, possibly one thing that's, I suppose, useful from the Democratic perspective, but from Russia's perspective, less helpful, is that a Biden administration is probably going to be more likely to accept intelligence reports about Russian involvement in the elections. Obviously, this is something that Trump himself was very against and sort of refused to acknowledge properly. But that's certainly something that would make it very difficult for the Russians. It might weaken Russia's ability to kind of divide the American academic and political community. But again, I think there are other things that Biden has done that I think rankled the Russians quite a bit. If we go back to 2011, for example, Biden did meet opposition figures in Russia when he went on a trip there. It was quite divisive at the time. He also kind of offered assurances that opposition groups in Russia wouldn't be forgotten by the Americans, and he was also quite he warned quite a bit about Putin's potential return to the presidency, which he obviously did. So I think that is something that the Russians repeat quite often as a count against him. And then even in the last few months, I think Biden's aligned himself quite obviously with specific values that I think Russia finds a little bit difficult. So the recent protests in Belarus, which have been going on since August following the elections, Biden has very obviously come out and backed the opposition forces. So he's obviously aligned himself with a certain political viewpoint that runs counter to what Russia would see as its national interests. So given all of this, you'd kind of think that maybe a Biden presidency would rule out any kind of dialogue with Russia. But then again, it's also quite clear, at least to me, that that Biden is interested in some kind of dialogue with Russia. He's said very clearly that even if you don't agree with a country and you find their views objectionable, you should still have to engage with them in some way. It sometimes means talking to countries that you don't agree with. And I think that bodes relatively well for prospects for discussion between the two of them.
Thanks. You mentioned Biden's support for the protests in Minsk and Belarus more broadly. I mean, the Trump administration has had a very Moscow-centric approach to Eurasian issues, and that has broken, I think, from the US consensus, which was very much engaged in some of the conflict issues of the region. Yet we haven't really seen much from the US on the Karabakh violence, on what's been happening in Belarus. The US has not really been taking a strong line on Ukraine and the conflict resolution activities there. How do you see the Biden administration approaching the wider region? Are we likely to see a return to a stronger support for some of the countries around Russia, which has often been seen as an effort to balance Moscow's role across Eurasian space?
Well, I'd certainly agree that there would be a deeper engagement with countries that you mentioned, so especially Ukraine, especially Belarus. Obviously, one of the things that in the Trump administration the Russians found quite useful was Trump's criticism of NATO and a lot of the increasing divisions between the member states. That was actually pretty helpful for Russia because they viewed that as a weakening of the bloc altogether. And you know, should Biden pursue a different course, which I assume that he would, to try to bring those countries back into the fold again and to improve those relationships, that would make it a lot more difficult for Russia to penetrate the bloc. As far as things in Belarus and Ukraine are concerned, I think that a lot of the Americans' actions in that space has not necessarily been the remit of the president or particularly directed by them. So obviously we've seen in Belarus, long before these protests started, there was quite a lot of effort from the Americans to present themselves as an alternative oil partner, for example, to try to draw Belarus away from Russia's economic influence. And you know, even though that's practically very inviable and very unlikely to come to any kind of fruition, it was interesting, I thought, that the Americans did try to wade into that very close security, political and economic relationship between Russia and Belarus. I was quite surprised. But, you know, when it comes to Ukraine, I think it's a little bit more problematic. And I'm sure everybody has kind of heard by now about the links between the Biden administration, his son Hunter, and some of his business interests in Ukraine. And obviously there was an inquiry, a Senate inquiry into that, where they found no substantive kind of conflicts of interest, but it does make it a little bit challenging for the Biden administration to be seen to be promoting, for example, a very strong anti-corruption agenda, which has been the Americans' purview since the beginning, since 2014, when the conflict broke out there, but at the same time have family links to businesses that are linked to Ukrainian oligarchs. So that complicates the picture a little bit. But I have no doubt that the Americans will renew their previous line on trying to balance Western interests in countries in which Russia considers themselves to have a very important political stake.
Thanks. I mean, I'd now like to move to the Middle East and North Africa, and our Dr. Anise Tabrizi, who leads our Unpacking the Middle East and North Africa program. Anise, the United States policy, well, its foreign and security policy has been historically defined by the Middle East. It's been closely involved in Middle East issues, Middle East conflicts. Today, you hear the view increasingly that the US is losing its interest in the region and indeed should stay away from the region's problems. What importance do you see that the Biden administration will give to the Middle East? And do you actually think that in many ways we'll just see a continued further loss of interest by the US in the region?
Thanks, Neil. I think, yeah, you're right that the Middle East doesn't feature anymore high in the US priorities. And I think this is exactly the case also under a Biden administration. I think what we are likely to see is the US doing less rather than more in the Middle East. And therefore, we are likely to continue to see some of the trends that we have already seen under the Trump presidency. I think it's very clear that Biden supports a drawdown of US forces from the Middle East to end the so-called forever wars. And the idea is that this would facilitate then a rebalancing of US resources to Asia, similarly to what we have been discussing so far. I think that means that developments in Afghanistan and perhaps even Iraq are likely to continue along the lines of a withdrawal of US forces, some of which will happen very, very soon after the mandate will start. But I think it's also clear that there is not going to be a complete disappearance of the Middle East from the US agenda under a Biden administration. There is support still for narrow missions, very much focused on counterterrorism, particularly when it comes to Daesh and Al-Qaeda. But there is also a focus on democracy promotion, defense of human rights, along the lines of what Virla was mentioning earlier about China, and also about economic and diplomatic engagement. So I think this is likely to continue to be the case, especially when it comes to coordination with allies and partners. So I think while the trend towards disengagement from the region will continue, especially in the longer run, because Biden really is stressing so much the need to engage with allies and partners, especially Europe, but also the UK, the US is likely to take into consideration the concerns and priorities of these partners, and the Middle East will feature high in this. So I don't really see a complete disappearance of the Middle East from the US agenda, especially on issues such as Iran, which I think it's likely to feature high, especially in the shorter term.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you mentioned, Iran is a dominating issue in US policy towards the region. Joe Biden has called Trump's policy on Iran a dangerous failure, particularly around the US position to pull out of the JCPOA and the ability to manage the nuclear question involving Iran. How do you see Biden approaching that issue, and how do you see Iran responding to a shift in the US on this question?
Well, I think it's no secret that Biden has made the Iran issue one of his priority. He has written an op-ed on the CNN. So his strategy is very clear. His priority is very clear on that front. I think Iran falls high in the arms control priorities, similarly to Russia, as mentioned by Emily. So I think, as you say, Biden has been critical of the Trump policy towards Iran, has been criticizing the fact that Iran is closer to have enough nuclear material to build a bomb now compared to when Trump took office back in 2017. And Biden has committed to reverse this trend. So I think there are significant speculation about the fact that Iran will actually feature as one of the main issues in foreign policy, especially that the new presidency will be dealing with in the first 100 days of its mandate. I think it's no secret that Biden wants to bring the US back into the nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Of course, conditional to the fact that Tehran also returns to compliance with the deal. And generally speaking, there will be a lot of more investment in diplomacy. The goal being for the US to engage more closely with its partners, especially France, Germany, and the UK, the so-called E3, to find ways for the JCPOA to be a starting point to strengthen and extend the nuclear agreement, while also focusing on Iran's behavior in the region. I think really like what Biden wants is to work also with regional partners, which has been something that has been missing in the Obama administration when it comes to Iran, not just to address the nuclear issue, but especially to reduce tensions and pushing both sides together towards a negotiating table. So while the strategy is very, very clear, I think it won't necessarily be easy. There are obviously different views in Tehran about how to handle the situation and what the Iranian posture should be to the Biden presidency. While engagement is certainly one of the ways in which some within Tehran's center of power are going to try to engage with the US. There are also those who push for increasing Iran's leverage ahead of talks, intensifying tensions in the region. I think a lot will depend on two things. One, domestic developments. We know that in Iran there are presidential elections taking place in June 2021. So a lot will depend on what internally will be the push for a posture towards the US. But a lot will also depend on the measures that Trump, frankly, will take over the next 2 months. There are already calls for adoption of additional sanctions on Iran, and some of these will make it harder, obviously not impossible, for Biden to reverse the steps that have been taken over the past 2 years.
Thanks, and perhaps I could now turn to another, I guess, priority area for the Trump administration, which has been its relations with India. Under President Trump, US-India relations have been quite successfully consolidated, reflecting perhaps a strong personal relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, but also the strategic priority of both countries. And this relationship has become a key pillar of the whole Indo-Pacific strategy that the US has promoted and that India has gone along with to some degree. I'd like to turn to Aditya Dave, who is part of our Indo-Pacific program leading work on South Asia. Aditya, how do you see the Biden administration approaching India? I mean, obviously there is this strategic imperative around balancing China, but unlike the Trump administration, the Biden administration has also put, as we've heard from others, the normative agenda quite high up on its priority list. And India under Prime Minister Modi has been taking a much more nationalistic approach to many questions. So how do you think that the Biden team is going to approach this question?
Thanks, Neil. So as you mentioned, I think while it is true that under President Trump, the two leaders shared a strong personal relationship, I think the good personal equations between leaders have been the norm in this relationship for about the last 2 decades. We've already seen Prime Minister Modi congratulating Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, emphasizing also the Indian-American connection with Kamala Harris. So I think there's probably going to be a pragmatic approach to the relationship from both sides. So as you mentioned, the strategic imperatives underpinning this relationship are quite important, along with the other sort of structural factors that drive the relationship forward, such as economic ties, as well as sort of the diaspora between the two countries. I think, as mentioned before as well, that India will find a sort of more predictable and a less impulsive partner to engage with, which might make things a bit easier, particularly on the economic side, which is quite important for India. So I think during the Trump administration, we did see a deepening and consolidation, as you mentioned, particularly on the defense and security side, but there was a heightening of tensions occasionally around trade and immigration. I think the immigration issues will likely be addressed to some degree under President Biden. And while the trade differences are more structural and longer term, the tone around these will probably get more palatable from an Indian perspective. So you will probably not see President Biden call India out on Harley-Davidson tariffs, for example. On the more strategic question, I think, as you mentioned, the growing competition with China, between the US and China, means that India will remain a vital partner for India for the US in the Indo-Pacific, and the US is the most important partner in South Asia across a variety of sectors, so defense and security, energy cooperation, technological development, humanitarian assistance, for example, among others. We've seen sort of recent developments such as the 2+2 dialogue between the defense and foreign ministers of the two countries, and the signing of significant defense agreements solidifying this partnership, which has grown across multiple administrations and lays the groundwork for greater cooperation. So while there is, I think, little to suggest that the current positive trajectory of the relationship will change, there may be a shift in emphasis and realignment of certain priorities that might have implications for US ties with India. I think, as mentioned before by Virla and others, I think while the Biden administration will look to focus on sort of also transnational issues and bring in more partners in its foreign policy, I think India will probably welcome the US rejoining things like the Paris Climate Accord and not leaving the World Health Organization, both of which are quite sort of important multilateral organizations for multilateral institutions for India as well. And I think, again, as Virla mentioned, there is some concern in India about the Biden administration's policy on China and the possible softening of its stance on China. But it is quite simplistic, and as Virla explained, so that explanation is quite simplistic, as Virla explained. There are quite a few factors that go into it, though it will be sort of crucial for India to follow what this policy is as it develops further. Biden has, for a long time been an advocate of deeper US-India relations, going back to his days as senator, when he played like a crucial role in getting the US-India nuclear deal through the Senate, and during his time as vice president, when essentially at the end of the Obama administration, the US declared India to be a major defense partner. He's also, as you mentioned, sort of the increasing focus on norms and values. Biden has also repeatedly stated his admiration for sort of India's diversity and inclusiveness in the past. And during the campaign, both him and sort of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have mentioned the issue of growing sort of illiberalism within India. And again, there is this concern in India about growing criticism from members of the Democratic Party about some of the current Indian government's policies, such as in Jammu and Kashmir, which have been criticized for being anti-Muslim. But I still think that pragmatism will likely prevail once the government is installed in the US, and some of this rhetoric will mellow. And although I don't think this will become a major sort of factor in the relationship, because I think broader geopolitical trends and strategic competition will drive the relationship. I don't think the Biden administration will be as willing to overlook some of these things as perhaps the Trump administration was. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks. Before I turn to our final commentator looking at the US policy towards sub-Saharan Africa, could I just remind the audience that now is a good time to start putting your questions in the question and answer part of the Zoom here. We've already got a few, but it'd be good to build up a few more as we go into the second half of our event. So I'd now like to turn to Andrew Chi, who leads the Africa in Perspective program at RUSI. Andrew, the Trump administration has given relatively little attention, arguably, to Africa. There's been a focus on managing some of Africa's wars and conflicts, particularly the Sahel, and maintaining its military presence and engagement around Somalia and security assistance. And then, of course, there was quite a lot of attention to the growing geopolitical competition with China and Russia. Under the Biden administration, do you see a broadening of the US engagement in Africa beyond that question? And sort of linked to question is, as we've touched on in other parts of our discussion already, there is now a push to move US military forces into the Indo-Pacific theater and perhaps away from Africa. How do you see the US remaining committed to Africa's conflicts?
Thank you very much, Neil. And I would say that I sort of echo a lot of what my colleagues have said before me as well. I don't think that we will see a massive push when it comes to, particularly on your latter question, security assistance, that we'll see a push towards not withdrawing troops. It's likely that these troops the withdrawal of troops will take place, and that's, I guess, the nature of which American politics is dictated or will be dictated towards Joe Biden. I think what we will definitely see, and what is, I think, more likely to happen, is you will definitely see a diplomatic U-turn, so more engagement with African partners, particularly traditional partners like Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, Uganda, Ethiopia, more of a diplomatic hand of extension. I think places like Somalia and South Sudan, which have had problems in the sense conflict and then the use of violence, I don't think there will be a U-turn in that. I think the approach would be more trying to get these countries, but also the actors on the ground, to resolve the various different conflicts. I think where Biden will try and focus his efforts will really be around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because that is, in essence, the second biggest bloc in the world. So he will try and focus around that to be able to secure the US's own interests. There'll be more bureaucracy, so really tied to the way in which countries are performing. So if a country is becoming more authoritarian, he will openly speak out against this. But again, as I think Verla and as Anissa have pointed out earlier, this idea of US values and norms. So really around democratic norms, human rights, the protection of civil liberties will be things that Biden will be pushing for. And in essence, if countries do not are not willing to comply with that, then he will tread carefully, but also be willing to call that out. I suspect at some point issues around instability in the Horn of Africa, in this case, the issue that's happening in Ethiopia, around the dam, Egypt, the issue around Sudan, you might see a potential drawback, but also more of a focus where it comes to maybe sending key political person. In this case, might be someone like Susan Rice, John Kerry, maybe Chris Coons, who might be actually sent on diplomatic or sent as a special envoy to help support some of these issues that are taking place. So I don't see an actual fully U-turn on this. I suspect there'll be more of a focus on bilateral but multilateral relationships, particularly because various different African people are at the helm, in particular the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, but also the ICC. So there'll be more of a focus in those areas. But again, the key for me is this upholding of democratic or US values, which needs to be defined or redefined really, because it's to a large extent, some of it hasn't worked, but a lot of that will really focus or encompass around democratic norms, human rights, and the protection of civil liberties as well.
Great, thanks very much. So perhaps now I could start with some of the questions that we've been getting in, and I think if I could group some of them together, I'll begin perhaps with a question particularly aimed at Virla, which is about the issue of China. Obviously, that's going to be a dominating one on the US policy, and we may, the drift towards the sort of bipolar world focused on China and the United States is likely to continue. So we've got a question from James London, which is about, I think, how the economic pressures on the Biden administration can be balanced with its ambition to do deterrence around China. So how is the US going to sustain sufficient military force, given that it has President Biden or President-elect Biden has announced that he's looking for sort of savings on the national security budget? How is he going to balance that? And then I think a linked question on for follow-up from James, which is really about what that means as regards areas like Taiwan and the vulnerability in the region that may be exposed by the lack of a military deterrence across the region. Vera, would you like to respond to that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question to which I don't have a definitive answer, but I do think that, one thing that we will be seeing is, of course, greater coordination and collaboration with allies in the region. So working with existing allies and existing partners, but also new ones. Now that, may be in different domains, it may be in different sectors, but I think military cooperation is something that we've already seen under Trump. And I don't see that this is something that a Biden administration would necessarily back away from. Working together with partner states in the maritime domain, for example, is something that particularly would help a cost, I don't want to say burden sharing, but a cost sharing and a distribution of efforts way forward for the United States under Biden. But you're right. I think on the question on Taiwan, this is a really important question when it comes to, how Trump will be remembered in China. It will be remembered quite unfavorably for how it strengthened its relationships with Taiwan right off the bat as soon as Trump came to power and was elected. And in Taiwan, Trump will be remembered favorably for that. Yes, there was, of course, an element of unpredictability when it came to Taiwan. But as I think time progressed, it's clear that Taiwan for the Trump administration was an important point in the wider China policy of the United States. And so for the Biden administration, we've seen Biden already be congratulated by President Tsai Ing-wen on Twitter. Biden likewise congratulated President Tsai Ing-wen earlier this year when she was elected for a second term in office. So we do see a relationship there continuing to unfold. But traditionally, we might not necessarily under this democratic administration see such a strong, I think, focus on Taiwan, and potentially more a return to a more ambiguous a level of ambiguity between those bilateral relationships. So what that means then for Taiwan and how it moves forward remains to be seen. But I think it is encouraging that, of course, when we talk about values, when we talk about the Biden administration focusing on democratic partnerships, it will be interesting to see how Taiwan, for all its success, around the coronavirus and how it has been able to handle this pandemic, will be included in some of these new engagements by the Biden administration. And likewise, whether the Biden administration will support Taiwan's accession, even in observer status, to the WHO, which he's already said he will step up its engagement with and bring the US back to the WHO. So in all these ways, I think it remains to be seen, but partnerships, working with allies, working with partners in the region and outside of the region. And here, I think we do look towards the UK, we look towards some European partners who have already expressed an increased engagement and an increased interest in being part and present in this part of the world. That will be something to look out for.
Thanks. I mean, I'm going to get some other questions about Russia, so I'd like to go to Emily on that. And I think this goes back to, Emily, you mentioned in your comments about the reset under President Obama. So we've got a question from Madeleine Moon about whether you see a willingness within the Biden presidency to engage in sort of a deconflictation dialogue, perhaps focused on military to military relations. And I suppose there are two ways of approaching this, perhaps from the Biden administration. One is a managing Russia's relations, which this military to military sort of dialogue might fit into, and whether there's scope just to try to manage the bilateral relationship to avoid tensions. And the broader one is this question about whether there's an effort to try to build a better relationship with Russia. So perhaps you could comment on that issue.
Yes, no, thank you very much for that question. And I also wanted to try to answer the other question that was sort of linked to this, which was sort of generally around engagement with Russia. I think it's been extraordinarily difficult, both for for the Americans and also I think for the European community more broadly, to engage with Russia when there are very clear violations of international standards. It can be exceptionally frustrating, but I think that certainly some of the things that I've seen from Biden's administration in the last few weeks have been quite promising, in the sense that I think there is a real willingness to develop a more positive relationship with Russia in the longer term, but specifically with the view to increase international security. So while there's a few kind of obvious issues that they could coordinate on, so as Madeleine mentioned, there could be certainly some scope for cooperation in a military to military sense in the Middle East. That's one issue that has been highlighted a few times, that is a very practical and obvious first course. But there are kind of, more fundamental ways of working together. And part of the problem is that when the political environment deteriorates to the point that a lot of perhaps softer ways to engage with Russia, like cultural initiatives, education initiatives, are shut down, necessarily as a kind of means of punishment of Russia when it violates international standards, and those relationships just disintegrate. It just means that there is a lack of communication between administrations at all levels. It means a lack of Russian language skills across the board. It's the same, I think, in certain European countries. It's the same in the UK. And that makes it extremely difficult to try to not just engage with Russia, but to try to understand the perspective that they come from. I mean, I think that just to respond to something that I noticed that James Llewellyn had written as well, was to try to talk about the European community as well and their approach to Russia versus the potential American approach to Russia. And I think I would say that despite the sanctions, obviously the European community is really not united on its approach to Russia. Probably the most obvious example of coordination was during the Skripal poisoning in 2018, when a lot of European countries, more than 20, expelled their Russian diplomats in a kind of show of unity. And that was probably the most effective and most obvious demonstration of a certain line on Russia. But then within the bloc, there is a serious disagreement about how or if to approach Russia at all. Countries like the Baltic states and Poland really do not favor any kind of compromise with Russia and find it very challenging to engage with them on certain issues. And then, you kind of have efforts by the Americans to sanction things like the Nord Stream pipeline, which obviously Germany is constructing at the moment, which sort of increases the divisions between the Americans and the European community. So I would say across the board, there really isn't a kind of coherent approach for how to engage with Russia or even whether to engage with Russia. It's a kind of deeply polarizing problem for which I think there really isn't an easy solution, unfortunately.
Thank you. Then I'd perhaps turn to the question from Rowley Sword, which is directed to Anise, which is about the issue of how the US-Saudi relationship can have a reset and what the reset might look like. And I guess this is against a backdrop of, I think some of the comments you made, Anise, that the US obviously does want to pivot away from the Middle East to some degree. And of course, we saw that under President Obama, when as the Yemen conflict flared up, he looked to the Gulf countries to actually take the lead on that. Now we see President-elect Biden apparently announcing that he wants the Saudis to end the conflict in Yemen. So how do you have a reset with Saudi and also pivot away from the region, as you indicated? What are the trade-offs here for the US?
Yeah, thanks, Neil, and thanks for the question, Rolly. I think it's very clear that one of the attempts by the Biden administration will be to end the US support to the Saudi-led war in Yemen. This is part of the broader effort that I talked about ending the forever wars, and I think Yemen is included in that list from the Biden administration. I think this has been something that has been very much part of the debate up until now, and also the rhetoric on Saudi Arabia has not been the most flattering. Biden has called Saudi Arabia a pariah state and has also talked about the need to halt the arms sale to Saudi Arabia, but more broadly also in the region. And I think, generally speaking, there is also an attempt by the Biden administration to move away again, like in line with what I said before, from the kind of confrontation and escalation towards some sort of engagement. Obviously, this means more engagement and diplomacy between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries and Iran, but also within the GCC countries. So when it comes also to the Qatar crisis, for instance, this has been featuring as one of the issues that Biden will want to address as well. What does this mean? I think it's very difficult to know at the moment, but it's very clear that Saudi Arabia and particularly MBS are not going to be in the same, I would say, privileged position or like a security position that they felt in 2017 when Trump visited Riyadh. That was his first trip to a foreign capital. And I think the perception of threat was much reduced when it came to the fact that the US was going to be a provider, a security guarantor, not just in terms of provision of weapons to counter the Iran aggression in the region or perceived aggression in the region, specifically in Yemen, but also more broadly in the region. And I think this is going to be very different now. I think the approach from a Biden administration will be more towards a rebalancing of the powers within the region and not for a favored approach towards Saudi Arabia. So I think from a Saudi perspective, it's going to be tricky, especially when it comes to then the Iran dossier, how this develops on the nuclear front, but also on the regional front. If there is a perception from Saudi Arabia that the US will be in a similar position to the last years of the Obama administration, closing up to Iran, specifically to deal with the nuclear issue, but also more generally with stronger diplomatic ties than ever before, I think the perception of threat will drastically increase in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much. And we're getting quite a lot of questions, I think, about the US relationship to the United States and the implications of the Biden administration for European foreign and security policy. So maybe it would be good to consolidate these and take a bit of a round of questions about what the Biden administration, the shift to the Biden administration actually means for Europe as a foreign and security policy actor in your parts of the world. Obviously, Biden has been highlighting US leadership, but that also means looking to partners to do more. So perhaps I could go to Andrew Chi and ask about the way you describe what sort of the long-term drift in US policy towards Africa, which is of decreasing importance. What do you think the implications of that would be for the Europeans now in terms of Africa? There's been obviously a European commitment to peace operations. The UK is looking to play a stronger role in some of these questions. There's also the Biden commitment to multilateralism, which may mean that we have a return to the UN as a peace and security actor and the focus for that in Africa.
I mean, in short, I do think what it will mean is that the European Union, but also in particular the UK, because obviously we're leaving early next year, will mean that we really have to step up to the plate and take leadership itself. I think we will get some leadership from the US, and in particular, it might be across the way in which multilateralism works and interactions. But I think it's going to be up to European partners, but in particular the UK, to be able to lead the way when it comes to Africa. I mean, other regions that might be different, but I think the US will have to really not necessarily take a step back, but really look to its European partners to engage. But I think also one of the key things that I think is also important in that the US would need to look beyond just the partnerships that are in Brussels, London, and in Paris, and really engage bilaterally with African countries. So I don't suspect that, there will be a massive, there will be a massive sort of focus on multilateralism, but I think it's going to be, the key point really is that the US is going to have to really rebuild, and that takes time. And so the focus really will be, how do we better support the European Union, but also how do we reform those individual partnerships that we need, particularly going forward. And that those countries that I mentioned earlier, Nigeria, South Africa, Ethiopia, are going to be key to the US's engagement in this area as well. But I think also it will focus more on this sort of African Union and REX, individual regions and sort of multilateral organizations, and really trying to push forward with some of its thinking on how Africa should move itself forward, particularly because Biden, I suspect, will move towards sort of a norm-based US thinking in terms of, we want human rights to be honored, we want democratic norms to be honored. So I think there'll be more efforts in that area than opposed to, trying to do things the way it probably did before, but because it's constrained because of the current situation as well, particularly back home as well.
And then Nise, it's the same sort of question to you, because obviously we've seen a significant decline in European influence in the Middle East that has also sort of gone hand in hand with a lower US engagement. And some people have been asking the questions about what the UK should do in places like Yemen. If there is a stronger US leadership, what actually would the Europeans need to do to support that in the Middle East?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think the question is also going to be very important to look at when it comes to what sort of relation the US will build with the UK specifically, which is a separate question that we can address as well. But I think generally speaking, in dossiers such as Yemen, as the US will try to end its support for the Saudi-led war, the UK will have to reconsider its support for Saudi Arabia and the Emirates as well. And I think that will also prompt a discussion about sales of weapons, which have already started, by the way, but need to be strengthened and will be strengthened, because again, we are going to be in a phase of rules-based international system, normative discussion, democracy promotion. All of this discussion, I think, will facilitate all of these debates, which have been a little bit paused, I would say, our sideline over the past 4 years. But I think in terms of the European specific role, there has been a tendency from European countries on one side to compensate for the US disengagement from the Middle East. Say with MSO mission, for instance, there has been a tendency to at least try to push for de-escalation in the region without going into the normative discussion about maximum pressure and the anti-Iran kind of framework. And I think that kind of debate will no longer need to take place. I think it's going to be easier for Europe to move closer to the United States to shape a shared transatlantic strategy on the Middle East. Whether that means putting aside any discussion on strategic autonomy, on a European specific role, which is either on maritime missions in the Middle East or on specific dossiers such as Yemen or others, I think it's early to say. But I think the wise thing from the European perspective would be to take forward the transatlantic cooperation discussion while also taking into consideration the fact that in 4 years' time, we might be again in a situation in which there is a divergent policy between the United States and Europe, and therefore Europe cannot exclusively rely on disengagement and alignment between the US and Europe to pursue its own interests in the region.
Okay, unfortunately, time is running fast. So perhaps as a last question, I'd like to go back to where we started, to Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, and a question for Vera, which has come in from Rolandus, who was asking about the implications of this shift in the Biden administration to Japan. And of course, I guess we've seen a change in the Prime Minister in Japan, the retirement of Prime Minister Abe, who was also one of the greatest advocates of the Indo-Pacific concept, and had really actually led that its emergence. So how do you see that relationship developing, and what implications does the double change of administration have for some of these ideas of how the Indo-Pacific region is framed as a security space?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. I think, and thank you to the person who asked that question. I think on U.S.-Japan relations, for all there was said about how Prime Minister Abe had approached Trump very proactively and maintained a positive relationship bilaterally, Trump did put pressure on Japan in a number of different ways. And of course, the continued and insistent message that Japan pay more and stop free riding on the United States and its alliance with the United States is something that I think the Biden administration will obviously move away from. Biden has already said that he will reinvest in the alliances that that the United States has in Asia, and that includes South Korea and Japan. So for a Suga administration and for a Biden administration, I think working together and finding ways to, one, continue to share information on the regional threat landscape, particularly attitudes towards China. And I think Japan will be looking towards the Biden administration as to how it approaches China, but also how the United States approaches Japan more generally as an alliance and as a key partner in the region. That this is a relationship that has to be conducted and has to be engaged with respect and with a certain amount of, I think, understanding of equal partnership here. And for the free and open Indo-Pacific, I think this is still a very important part of the new Japanese administration. So for a Suga government, I think they'll be looking for indications from the Biden administration that it will not be abandoning the Indo-Pacific strategy that was developed under Trump, even if it is reformed or evolved in one way or another. And that really, this remains an important part of U.S. foreign policy. So working together, whether on trade, whether on, discussing multilateralism and re-engaging in that, whether it's around shared norms, values, rules of the road, those are all ways in which I think Japan and the U.S. will still, of course, be fairly aligned and we'll be looking for ways to cooperate and collaborate. But I think also in some of these new areas, particularly around new technology, particularly around supply chain resilience and diversification, again, another area where I think Biden and Suga administration will be looking towards cooperating more fervently. So a few thoughts there, but I'm happy to dive into this on another occasion because it is a very important question.
Well, thanks so much, Vera. I think that's a very good point to conclude on. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us. And I mean, and apologies, I couldn't get to all the questions. We've got a bit of a rush towards the end, and unfortunately we couldn't cover those, but perhaps our experts could take a look at them and respond to any that they're able to. I mean, it's a fascinating time. I mean, it's clearly a critical time. I mean, some of the issues I take away from the discussion is that foreign and security policy is increasingly complex and interrelated. And obviously the Biden administration is going to have to struggle with that. This is what we hear, I think, from all of the experts in the ISS team, is that regions around the world are becoming interlinked, not least because as the US declines relatively, it's going to have to prioritize, which means that it can't maintain its former presence in many of these regions. And this means, of course, that there are quite significant continuities going to take place while we're focusing on the changes that Biden's going to bring. The US does face an agenda that is a set of strategic questions that have been running really for the last decade and a half about its relative priorities and its shift to the Asia-Pacific region, and how it then manages its engagements in other parts of the world, notably the Middle East, Africa, and of course, to some degree, Russia and the European space. And while there's obviously is a desire by the US to pivot, it also finds it very difficult to disengage. I mean, we're still talking about US troops finally coming home from Iraq, the Middle East, from Afghanistan, from Somalia and the Sahel, despite President Trump promising that would happen, and now President Biden coming in to saying that will happen. So we'll have to see how easy disengagement is. And the last point I take, of course, that disengagement by the US is obviously going to mean others stepping up to take on that role. And that's going to be a big challenge for the Europeans, but other regional actors too. And this is what some of the issues I think that we'll be looking at more in all of the programs that we're running at RUSI over the next year or so. So please, if you'd like to follow these questions in more detail, as Vera said, then check our website. We have a lot of events coming up where we're going to dive into these in more detail. Already this week, Anise's got an event coming up later on the US and the Middle East with a stellar cast of experts. So if you'd like to learn more about that, then please check our website and sign